The Caribbean is no longer just a trade corridor. It is a battlefield of shadows where narco cartels, smugglers, and corrupt regimes move drugs, money, and weapons across the sea. At the center of this web sits Venezuela, where Nicolás Maduro's government is accused of shielding and enabling traffickers tied to powerful cartels. In response, the United States has chosen not to whisper, but to roar. When U.S. Navy destroyers and Marine expeditionary units appeared near Venezuelan waters, it sent a shockwave through the region. This was not a quiet or accidental move, but a deliberate escalation. The deployment was a physical declaration that American military reach knows no boundaries and that geography offers no sanctuary. The presence of these forces signaled that the United States was prepared to go far beyond sanctions and diplomatic condemnations. The target was not just drug shipments, but the Maduro regime itself, now branded as complicit in what Washington called narco-terrorism. The decision was centered on the U.S. drug crisis. The Trump administration, under pressure from rising fentanyl and cocaine trafficking, framed the crisis as an external war being waged against American society. Venezuela was accused of being a direct pipeline for these substances, with Maduro's government facilitating massive shipments northward. For Washington, this crisis created both urgency and justification. The legal and political foundation for military action was reinforced by classifying Latin American cartels as terrorist organizations, including groups tied directly to Maduro's regime. This label was more than rhetorical. It aligned cartel operations with the same framework used to pursue groups like Al-Qaeda, justifying strikes and interdictions as counterterrorism. The destroyers near Venezuela carried that doctrine in their deployment orders. The Justice Department's criminal charges against Nicolás Maduro hardened the rationale for this stance. He was no longer just a political adversary, but a wanted man, indicted on drug trafficking offenses. Charging a head of state is a legal escalation, placing him in the same category as a cartel boss and stripping away any shield of political legitimacy. Destroyers and Marines off Venezuela's coast became the physical embodiment of that accusation. The deployment was also a clear attempt to shift the balance of power, reminding Maduro and his allies that American pressure was not confined to economics and speeches, but could be measured in warships and expeditionary forces.
Before we get to that, I need your help. I'm trying to hit 50,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and I need your help. So I would really appreciate it if you could subscribe and help me out.
The regime, which had long survived sanctions with the help of Russia, China, and Cuba, was now confronted with a different kind of pressure. Every day Maduro remained in power was another day Washington believed democracy was smothered in Venezuela. The deployment was framed as a regional security necessity, as cartels linked to Venezuela destabilized the Caribbean and South America. The Trump administration argued that unchecked trafficking endangered allies and expanded the influence of hostile regimes. Destroyers were positioned to intercept shipments before they reached transit hubs, while Marines added a layer of deterrence with their ability to project force ashore. The message to regional partners was direct. The U.S. would carry the burden of confrontation, but it expected alignment in return. Preparation for this had been telegraphed for months, with the Navy staging interdiction exercises and Marine units rehearsing rapid deployments for counter-narcotics operations. Intelligence flights had also intensified, mapping drug routes and tracking cartel aircraft. These were not isolated steps, but part of a drumbeat toward escalation, designed to leave no doubt that the U.S. was ready to pivot from surveillance to action. The scale of the move was not symbolic. Destroyers carry advanced radar, anti-air, and strike capabilities. Marine units are structured for flexibility, able to conduct raids, secure territory, and provide rapid response. Together, they create a package capable of both blockade and invasion. For Venezuela, the sight of these forces offshore was a reminder that the U.S. had the ability to cut supply lines, seize shipments, and strike directly at regime-linked facilities. For Maduro and his allies, it was an existential signal. U.S. military presence so close to his coast suggested that his survival could no longer be guaranteed by internal repression alone. The problem was the lethal influx of narcotics, the designation of cartels as terrorists, and the indictment of a sitting head of state. The solution, as envisioned by the Trump administration, was a forward-deployed military presence capable of interception and intimidation. The logic was simple. If cartels and Maduro's regime were treated as narco-terrorists, the tools of counterterrorism would be brought to bear. Destroyers and Marines became the solution manifested in steel and manpower. The seriousness of the move was validated by statements from the Justice Department confirming charges against Maduro and the State Department reiterating the regime's illegitimacy. The destroyers off Venezuela's coast were not phantoms. They were photographed, tracked, and reported, their presence undeniable. Urgency coursed through every stage of the escalation, driven by a drug epidemic killing thousands monthly in the U.S., and the failure of traditional sanctions to dislodge Maduro. This deployment was a countdown in motion. The line between law enforcement and military action was being erased. The deployment was not just about Venezuela, but about rewriting the playbook for how the U.S. confronts narco-trafficking regimes worldwide. It was proof that the era of warnings had passed and the era of force projection had begun. For Maduro, it was the reminder that his power was fragile when challenged by a superpower. For the region, it was the signal that Venezuela was no longer just a national crisis, but an international fault line. The destroyers and Marines were a declaration that state power would be met with state power in return. Guided missile destroyers now patrol near Venezuelan waters, projecting hard power with a single aim: cut off cartel-linked smuggling routes and squeeze the regime that profits from them. Their firepower is less important than their authority to interdict. Every suspicious vessel is subject to boarding and seizure, transforming smuggling lanes into risk zones. Each successful interdiction not only removes tons of narcotics from circulation, but also dismantles the financial arteries that sustain both cartels and the Maduro regime.
Before we get to that, I need your help. I'm trying to hit 50,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and I need your help. So I would really appreciate it if you could subscribe and help me out.
The destroyer's hidden strength is their surveillance capabilities. With advanced sensors, satellite links, and airborne assets, they paint a real-time map of maritime activity. This persistent watch disrupts trafficking before it reaches U.S. coastlines. Yet destroyers alone are not enough. Smugglers adapt quickly, often using hidden landing sites. This is where Marine expeditionary units bring decisive leverage. They can deploy within hours to coastal areas and strike directly at cartel infrastructure, like stash houses and clandestine airstrips where naval power cannot reach. The psychological impact of this presence is as powerful as the physical one. For smugglers, the knowledge that destroyers and Marines are in their waters breeds fear and hesitation. Routes once considered safe now feel like traps. For regional governments, the show of force offers reassurance and incentive to align with American efforts. The tempo of operations ensures urgency. Every day, without a successful shipment means lost profits and increased risk for traffickers and the Maduro regime. This campaign is relentless, with intelligence cycles running continuously because cartels and their state backers exploit any gap. The U.S. is not just talking about threats, it is actively countering them. By projecting power near Venezuela, the United States has turned open waters into contested zones, forcing traffickers to face a force they cannot outgun and a presence they cannot ignore. Maduro's regime is no longer insulated by geography or corruption. It is exposed by the very sea it depends on. The truth is stark. U.S. power projection is not about flexing for show. It is about cutting veins. The fight against narco submarines and cartel gunboats is not a routine. It is a cat-and-mouse war fought with the most advanced intelligence assets the U.S. possesses. The U.S. has built a surveillance web from space to the seabed. The first layer is air-based. Boeing P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft sweep the Caribbean daily with advanced radar and sensors that can spot the faint outlines of a semi-submersible. This persistent aerial presence denies smugglers the element of invisibility. At sea, destroyers with advanced radar and sonar can detect the acoustic signatures of semi-submersibles, vectoring aircraft and patrol craft to close in. Beneath the surface, U.S. attack submarines patrol silently, trailing suspected narco subroutes. They can match the stealth of semi-submersibles, shadowing them undetected for miles. The smugglers may evade radar and aircraft, but they cannot escape the ears of a hunter-killer submarine lying in wait. Above it all, space-based sensors tie the picture together. Synthetic aperture radar satellites provide imaging through clouds and darkness, mapping vessel activity across the Caribbean with precision. When a ship disappears from civilian tracking networks, satellites continue to watch. These gaps, once exploited by smugglers, are now red flags that draw immediate attention. Signals intelligence closes the circle. Intercepted communications are triangulated and matched against vessel movements. When a narco sub transmits an encrypted message, it is not just a message sent. It is a location revealed. For smugglers, connectivity is a lifeline. For U.S. intelligence, it is a leash that pulls them into the open. The integration of these layers, aircraft, ships, submarines, satellites, and drones, creates a web designed to suffocate cartel logistics. The United States doesn't have to fire a single shot to rattle the Maduro regime. The battlefield begins long before combat through psychological operations that weaponize perception and fear. By projecting overwhelming power and controlling the narrative, Washington makes Maduro and his allies feel cornered and isolated, forcing them to question every move. The most visible tactic is the public display of military power. These deployments are covered in the press and visible on satellite imagery, ensuring the regime understands that the world's most powerful military is at its doorstep. To cartels, those ships represent a closing noose, a reminder that their logistics corridors can be cut at will. The projection of power itself creates paralysis, forcing adversaries to overthink and second-guess. Strategic messaging magnifies the pressure. The U.S. labels the Maduro regime a narco-terror cartel, a designation that strips away legitimacy and recasts leaders as gangsters. By controlling the narrative, Washington isolates Maduro diplomatically, aligning allies under the banner of opposing a criminal state. For cartels tied to the regime, association with Maduro is now a liability rather than protection. The media becomes the amplifier, broadcasting every deployment and indictment. The threat of military action hovers constantly as senior U.S. figures repeat the phrase, "all options on the table." This calculated ambiguity is designed to maximize fear and force the regime to live in perpetual uncertainty. It ties up regime resources in constant defensive posturing and sows paranoia within military ranks. Another critical psyop is the disruption of Maduro's own narrative. U.S. revelations about his drug trafficking charges puncture the regime's claims of defending national dignity, replacing them with the perception of criminality. This fuels dissent as military officers and citizens see their government tied directly to cocaine shipments. Psychological operations also target regional allies, forcing them to choose sides and isolating Maduro further. The perception of abandonment erodes his international leverage and discourages support from Russia, China, or Cuba These elements interlock into a psychological campaign aimed at pre-battle collapse, to weaken morale, erode trust, and fracture alliances. The brilliance of these operations lies in their economy, maximum effect with minimal physical risk. The US creates a battlefield of the mind where fear, doubt, and perception become the decisive weapons. In this war of perception, the regime and its cartel partners face the certainty that they are overmatched before the first shot is ever fired. The US show of force compels cartels to abandon coastal smuggling hubs through a chain reaction of strategic, psychological, and logistical impacts. The presence of naval destroyers is a warning that the free flow of shipments will no longer go unnoticed. What was once a sanctuary becomes a trap. The most immediate impact is the increased risk of interdiction. Every cartel shipment now faces constant surveillance from advanced radar, drones, and maritime patrols. The equation for cartels is brutal. The likelihood of detection, interception, and loss of shipment skyrockets. A single lost load can mean tens of millions in lost revenue, an existential blow to their business model. The deployment also disrupts established routes that cartels built over years. Smuggling thrives on predictability, but when destroyers linger offshore, predictability vanishes. Routes once considered secure transform into danger zones, forcing traffickers to improvise with riskier, less efficient alternatives. This disruption feeds directly into the reduction of safe havens. Coastal hubs, once fortified ecosystems supported by corrupt protection, now become exposed to surveillance and potential strikes. Cartels must ask if investing in such hubs is still viable when a single US maneuver can compromise years of infrastructure. The show of force also delivers a deterrent psychological pressure. The visual dominance of US naval vessels sends a clear message. The cost of maintaining coastal smuggling points will be unbearable. Confidence erodes not through direct battle, but through the quiet weight of intimidation. This intimidation accelerates forced fragmentation and displacement. As major hubs become untenable, cartels are pushed to abandon centralized operations and splinter into smaller, less resourced groups. Fragmentation weakens operational cohesion and erodes economies of scale. Meanwhile, the ripple effect of the US presence strengthens regional coordination. Neighboring countries, emboldened by the American show of force, increase their own patrols, share intelligence, and close gaps that cartels might exploit. The psychological effect of watching not only US destroyers, but also regional patrols converge on their former safe zones compounds the sense of being hunted. For cartels, coastal hubs are no longer viable strongholds. They are pressure points collapsing under combined force. The strategic payoff is immense. By forcing the abandonment of coastal hubs, the US does not simply disrupt drug shipments, it dismantles the infrastructure that allows cartels to thrive. Every hub abandoned represents a collapse of trust, a financial loss, and a psychological defeat. The symbolism is as powerful as the tactics. Destroyers looming over Venezuelan waters embody the collapse of cartel certainty. For traffickers, the image of US warships patrolling their doorstep is a reminder that even the strongest havens can be dismantled with overwhelming force. The US show of military force near Venezuela also operates as a tool of diplomatic pressure. Each deployment highlights Maduro's regime status as an outcast tied to drug trafficking and criminal networks. This discourages fence-sitting and forces wavering countries to reconsider their stance toward Caracas. The visible projection of force limits Maduro's options for external support and reduces the number of governments willing to legitimize his rule. This isolation has another consequence. It reinforces the legitimacy of the Venezuelan opposition. When the world sees US warships challenging Maduro's government, opposition movements feel less abandoned and gain geopolitical momentum. The deployments also work as a shield against Maduro's provocations. The presence of U.S. destroyers shifts the calculus dramatically, as any aggressive maneuvers carry greater risk when American warships are within striking distance. The message is not subtle. Reckless escalation will be met with immediate counterweight. Beyond Maduro, this is also a message to other capitals, like Moscow and Beijing, that the U.S. remains the dominant guarantor of security in Latin America. The sight of American hardware reaffirms where real power lies. The genius of such posturing lies in its ability to achieve these outcomes simultaneously without direct confrontation. A destroyer need not fire a shot to change the calculations of multiple actors at once. The U.S. earns credibility through presence, through proof, and through unmistakable shows of capability. Warships do not bluff. Their presence cannot be ignored or misinterpreted. They reassure allies, deter Maduro, isolate his regime, and embolden opposition forces. The U.S. posture is both shield and sword, a shield for allies and a sword that cuts deeper into the isolation of a regime running out of room to maneuver. The deployment is designed to remind everyone that the U.S. can intervene in the Western Hemisphere instantly with overwhelming force. Proximity to Venezuelan shores carries the weight of theater and intimidation. These warships sit close enough for Caracas to sense their presence, a psychological chokehold on the government. The technology on display makes the warning not only visible, but undeniable. The guided missile destroyers are armed with Tomahawk cruise missiles and Aegis combat systems. Layered onto this are surveillance aircraft and attack submarines, extending both reach and intelligence collection. For Venezuela's leadership, it is a question of omnipresence, with radar signatures tracked in real time and communication networks infiltrated. Equally vital is the Marine Expeditionary Unit. The MEU is a self-contained combat force built to move from sea to land at a moment's notice, signaling readiness to act. Its presence tells Maduro that if ordered, Marines could be on Venezuelan soil within hours. This deployment also leans on America's track record of global power projection. The U.S. has a history of decisive intervention, and Venezuela is within what the U.S. has long considered its strategic backyard. The doctrine of reach is amplified by precedent. Modern warfare is also built on real-time synchronization between space-based surveillance, naval radar, and signals intelligence. Venezuela is not merely being watched from the shoreline, but from orbit, from underwater, and from the skies. This integration transforms deployment into omnipresence, offering the regime no blind spots, no hidden reserves, and no surprise maneuvers. The psychological dimension cannot be overstated. For the regime, the sight of U.S. destroyers and the knowledge of Marines offshore serve as a constant reminder of vulnerability. It is a deterrent calculated to erode confidence, sow doubt, and paralyze aggression. For cartel networks, the message is harsher still. The world's most advanced military is prepared to project force against them just as it would against a nation-state. The U.S. deployment is not a military maneuver. It is a rewriting of the balance of power in the Caribbean basin. The message is written in steel and firepower, anchored just beyond Venezuelan waters. This is the language of loss aversion made real. Any misstep could cost Maduro not just political standing, but the survival of his regime. There is no refuge from American reach. The warning has been issued. The presence is real. The consequences of defiance are already in view. The deployment of U.S. destroyers and Marine Expeditionary Units near Venezuela is not a symbolic maneuver. It is a declaration, sharp and unmistakable, that American military reach knows no boundaries. The message is engineered for clarity. Geography offers no sanctuary, distance offers no buffer, and the regime of Nicolas Maduro stands directly under the shadow of American power.